Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue to talk about ancient Rome. Specifically, what we want to continue to look at here is the Roman Republic or the early Republic. As mentioned in part one, throughout Rome's existence, there's really two time periods: the Roman Republic, which embraced democracy, and then there's the Roman Empire, which had one ruler called an emperor. And they are two very different time periods in Roman history. So we're going to talk about the early republic. We're going to talk about some of the cultures, some of the ways they governed and ruled, but we're also going to talk about the Punic Wars, and that's going to show us the might of the Roman military, which is no doubt one of the high points of Roman culture because their military was very, very good. So let's move into this. All right, early Rome. Early Etruscan kings and their successors built temples and public centers in Rome. This is going to definitely set up the fact that the Romans were pretty darn good builders, so keep that in mind. One of the things that the Etruscans used was something called the Forum. The Forum became the heart of Roman political life, and I'm going to show you some examples of this in pictures here momentarily. After Rome's last king was driven from power in 509 BC. That's a mistake. That should be after the Etruscans' last king was driven from power in 509 BC for being too harsh. The Romans declared they would never again be ruled by a king. So pardon my typo there. That's supposed to be the Etruscans' last king. Basically, the Romans saw this way of governing and they didn't want anything to do with it. They did not like the idea that a king could tell them what to do, which is going to be very ironic because later on they're going to give all of the power in Rome to one person called an emperor. But in the early days, they did not want to be ruled that way. And we can see some parallel here because the United States government was formed the same way. We didn't want a king like they had in England, so we set up a democratic form of government. So just like that, the Romans established a republic. Republic meant public affairs, and essentially meant the public, the people, had a role in deciding how the government would operate. I mean, that's the core of democracy. So a republic is a form of government in which power rests with citizens who have the right to vote for their leaders. So what that tells us is when Rome was founded, after the Etruscans were done, they set up a democracy. Of course, when you're talking about voting, you had to be a citizen. Well, citizenship did not extend to everybody. So in Rome, citizenship with voting rights was granted only to free-born male citizens. And that free-born part is going to be important because there's going to be a lot of slavery in Rome. And slaves, of course, would not have been allowed to vote. Women would not have been allowed to vote. So there is some drawbacks to their form of democracy. I mentioned the Forum. The Forum is where you did your shopping. The Forum is where you read books. The Forum is where you had conversations about philosophy, about government. It was like a shopping mall and a government center all in one. And this is an example of one of the forums that was used in Rome. Of course, this is a model. But you can see how elaborate they would have been. So this would have definitely been full of markets and people and conversations. It would have been a very busy and intellectual place to be. This is the ruins, partial ruins of one of the forums in Rome today. So definitely worth checking out if you ever get a chance to go to Rome. All right, let's talk about the people of Rome. People of Rome were really divided into a number of different groups. So Rome was divided up into several different groups who struggled for power. First, you had the patricians. The patricians were the wealthy landowners who held most of the power. As we see in history, those with money, those with land, typically have a lot of power and influence. A lot of times land means wealth. The more land you have, the more wealth you have. So that was very true here in Rome. Then you had the plebeians. The plebeians were the common farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. They were the majority of the population. So you can see that here. You've got your patricians here. They might be senators. They just might be landowners. They might live on big estates. Then you can see the plebeians. They look like they're either farmers or they're selling something. They're pretty poor. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of slavery. going on in Rome. I mean, 90% of the population of Rome was poor or very close to being poor. It was a very imbalanced system of wealth. And that's going to be problematic much later on when we get to the fall of Rome. Another group that you had was something called the tribunes. The tribunes were elected representatives who protected the rights of the plebeians from patrician officials. It sounds like a mouthful. I like to think of them as modern day lawyers. You know, you've got one group looking out for the next group. So the tribunes existed to make sure that the patricians didn't pass laws to limit the plebeians and basically push them out of society. And so I think they were a very good role. They were a very useful role. And certainly if you were one of the poor people, you were glad they were there. Rome's government was made up of consuls. A consul really never ruled by themselves, because otherwise you would have had like an emperor or a dictatorship. So with these consuls, they were two officials with limited power and 1-year terms. One of these consuls controlled the government, the other directed the government. It's like a check and balance. So one person couldn't have total control, and that's really smart in the early days of the Roman Republic. So you had these two people that had power. They didn't have total control, and they only had 1-year terms. So there was a lot of turnover and a lot of change in power in the early Republic. Now, in times of crisis, you could elect a dictator. Now, the dictator was not supposed to be your emperor or somebody who had power forever. Pay attention to this, because I think this is really, in a way, sort of smart, but it also leaves the door open for one person to ultimately assume power indefinitely. So a dictator, in times of crisis, the Republic could appoint a leader with absolute power to make laws and control the army. It'd be basically having the role of both consuls, but their power was supposed to only last for 6 months. So this would be like if an invading army was coming into Rome and you needed somebody to make decisions really quickly, you would elect a dictator to do that. And as soon as the threat was gone, that person would step down. It was definitely an honor to be elected as a dictator, but it was also a very stressful job. The army was made up of legions. Legion is a military unit made up of 5,000 soldiers. So some generals could command several legions. So, for example, if you had 3 legions, you had 15,000 soldiers. These are really well trained, very disciplined, hardworking soldiers. Some of them were farmers by trade and had other professions, but when called upon, they were very, very good at fighting. This diagram just shows the setup of the Roman government. You have the patricians and the plebeians that I mentioned. You have your 2 consuls running the government. You had your 10 tribunes. You also had a senate, much like our senate, that could help pass laws. And then you had your voters, your citizens assembling here to, basically make up the population here. So if you want to, you can take a moment and pause and look at that. All right, Roman power expands. Well, steadily the Romans conquered the Italian peninsula. They're going to take over the land owned by the Etruscans. They're going to take over the land owned by any other tribes there. And they're just going to continue to expand and expand and expand. And as Rome conquered lands, people were absorbed into their ever-growing territory. One of the things that the Romans did is they extended citizenship to those who they conquered. So some people were accepted as citizens. Others simply became allies. And if you were accepted as a citizen, that meant you had the right to vote. The Romans wanted you to be a part of their empire, which of course meant you had to pay taxes as well. But they didn't just conquer and, make you into something. They brought you into the democratic process, which I think is pretty remarkable. Eventually, Rome saw there was another city down south, just straight south of them, across the Mediterranean Sea in Africa, called Carthage. And Carthage represented a threat to Rome. They were a very powerful city in North Africa. And these 2 cities are going to fight a series of wars known as the Punic Wars. So the struggle became known as the Punic Wars, which lasted from 264 to 146 BC. A couple of very famous stories comes out of the Punic Wars. I'm going to show you this map first. You can see here, it's not the greatest map. If I can get my cursor, here's Rome. If we go pretty much straight south across the Mediterranean, we have Carthage. Carthage was eyeing land that Rome had, so that's why Rome saw them as a threat. And what we're going to see is we're going to learn about a guy named Hannibal. And Hannibal is going to do something remarkable. He's going to travel all the way across Africa, cross over into Spain, and take his army through the Pyrenees Mountains and over the Alps and try to attack Rome. And it becomes one of the most legendary military campaigns in history. Literally one of the very, very few at the top that historians still talk about today. So Carthage was led by a brilliant general named Hannibal. Hannibal assembled an army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, which of course is men on horseback, and 60 elephants intent on capturing Rome. Think about that. That's a huge force, and had elephants, something probably most of the Romans had never seen before. And he led his troops up through Spain and crossed the Alps into Italy. And I've got a few images I want to show you of this. Here you see crossing the Alps. We know this happened. There's lots of artifacts that have been found in the Alps that date back to not only the right time period, but also connected to Hannibal and his army. So there's no doubt that this was a very true story. It's another image of Hannibal and his men and their horses and, of course, their elephants. And so Hannibal and his team make it into Rome, and they just about capture Rome. Not very often in history do we give somebody credit for almost doing something, but he gets really close to capturing Rome. Problem is the Romans see an opportunity to take Carthage, so they travel south to attack Carthage, and in a very simplified way, Hannibal's got to decide, am I going to stay and conquer Rome, but also maybe lose Carthage in the process, or should I go back home and defend my home city? And so ultimately he did choose to go back to Carthage and defend the city. So the Romans almost besieged at Rome, eventually regrouped and prevented Hannibal from sacking Rome. Sacking is a historical term that means taking over. And through 3 Punic War battles, Rome eventually defeats Hannibal in 202 BC near Zama. Zama is in Africa. It's very near Carthage. So Rome eventually defeated Carthage in the 3rd Punic War. And the significance of this is Rome's now got a base in North Africa. They are now on multiple continents. So they not only have Europe, but now they've got Africa, and their land is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. So Rome's territory and power would only get bigger and stronger. So you can see eventually they will control the land all the way around the Mediterranean Sea. All right, to wrap up our lecture on Roman geography in the early Republic, we're going to revisit our 3 constructive response questions. And remember, only one of these questions we can truly answer right now, and that's the first one. First question says, describe who the earliest Roman settlers were and how Rome was founded according to the Romans. Well, we know that the earliest Roman settlers were the Latins, the Greeks, and the Etruscans. And if we can just give one example of culture that they provided the Romans from each of those groups, I think we'll be pretty set in answering the first part of that question. So we can talk about how the Latins gave the Romans their language, which became Latin. The Greeks, man, we could talk about the religion that they gave the Romans, the architecture, democracy, at least in the early days. Lots of great things that the Greeks provided the Romans. And then the Etruscans. The Etruscans were skilled metal workers. They gave Rome its the arch, which is definitely something you see in their architecture. They certainly gave them their lust for killing, which is very prevalent in the gladiatorial battles that often took place in the Colosseum. So if we could have one sentence on each one of those, we'd be in good shape. The second part of that question, though, we would need to talk about Remus and Romulus' story. They wanted to build a city. They were raised by a she-wolf. Eventually, Romulus kills Remus, and that's where we get the name Rome from. We think that never happened. It's probably a myth, but at least to the Romans, that would have been their story of where Rome came from. So we can answer that question. The second two questions we're going to build upon. Compare and contrast the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire using specific examples. You've got a pretty good idea of what the Roman Republic is. We're going to further that in the next story, so that'll make a little bit more sense. Certainly we're going to have more information on the Roman Empire as we progress through this unit. And the last question, classify the contributions the Romans made to the cultural advancement of the world. I mean, we know some things from Engineering and Empire because we've already watched that. And we've seen the Colosseum, we've seen the Pantheon, we've seen the Roman bathhouses, the Roman roads, all these wonderful things. But we're going to continue to look at more of those as we progress through this unit. So rate yourself on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale there. Certainly practice these questions because you know 2 of these will have to be answered on your test at the end of the unit. And they might be 2 of these that you're actually seeing right here. So that's going to do it for us here on Early Rome. Hope you learned something. We'll talk to you next time.